After we got free, then they turned us out like cattle. We didn't have nowhere to go. We didn't have nobody to boss us. And we didn't know nothing. There wasn't no school.
How much school did you go to? I know one school would be in like not hours.
We don't have a recording of Frederick Douglass, but we do have historic recordings of Fountain Hughes and Bob Ledbetter in an exhibit at the National Constitution Center. They'd been enslaved before the Civil War, and their voices were recorded in the 1940s. Their stories echo the journey of Frederick Douglass. In his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, Douglass described the moment his master, Hugh Auld, ordered his wife Sophia to stop teaching Douglass how to read. "If you teach a slave how to read, there would be no keeping him," Hugh exclaimed. Learning to read would forever unfit him to be a slave because he would become unmanageable and of no value to his master.
And Douglass reflects later, he said, that was the first anti-slavery speech I ever heard. If reading mattered so much to this man, and he feared it so much, then maybe I should go do more of that.
Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. Frederick Douglass.
Hello, friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and this is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. In this 11th of 12 episodes, I'm joined by Yale historian David Blight, author of Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. We'll hear about the journey for justice that eventually led Douglass to go toe-to-toe with none other than President Abraham Lincoln. It wasn't a clash of enemies, but a debate rooted in mutual respect. And we'll hear from acclaimed filmmaker and America's storyteller, Ken Burns.
If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Frederick Douglass.
Let's turn to the life of Frederick Douglass with author David Blight. I'm so excited to talk with you about the great Frederick Douglass. In your definitive biography, you describe his remarkable education, and in particular, the transformative experience of learning how to read.
Well, he spent the first 20 years of his life as a slave, and his education involves absolutely no formal education, never a day of his life in an actual classroom. His education, though, accelerates, if you like, when he gets sent to Baltimore. When he's about 7 years old, comes back to the Eastern Shore for a while, but spends about 11 of his 20 years as a slave in Baltimore. Great ocean port, maritime industries. He works in the shipyards as a teenager. He meets all kinds of people in that urban environment. He attends 4 different churches. He had a mentor who helped him read the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, the Hebrew prophets, a man called Rosen. We'd probably call him a kind of storefront preacher. And Douglass made connections in the streets, both as a laborer, a worker, and then as a person always trying to find what he could learn next and learn next. He gains his literacy from his mistress, Sophia Auld, who was the wife of Hugh Auld, and that literacy was a complete turning point in his consciousness. And even though Hugh Auld, the master at that point, tried to make him stop reading, and then eventually, when he's about 12 years old, he purchases or barters for his own copy of the Columbian Orator, which was a collection of great speeches and a kind of a manual of oratory. And there is a pretty direct line one can draw from his possession of that book. It was a school reader, first compiled in actually 1797. It's a late 18th century book. But Douglass loved that book and just ingested it. It's not just about why is oratory important, but it's even about the physicality of it, how to modulate the voice, what to do with your arms and your shoulders. And there's a whole section in it about how oratory, which of course was a very common and powerful thing in the 19th century, it even has a section about how oratory must reach the moral heart or consciousness of the audience, that an orator must have not just an argument, but a message, an emotional message and an intellectual message. It's a quirky, strange book. It includes dialogues, and one of them is about a slave who simply persuades his owner to free him. Now, it's not very realistic, but you can imagine if you were reading that particular part of it as a 9-year-old or even a 12-year-old, you might think, oh, that's pretty compelling. A slave could convince his master to free him. So he has possession of this reader from when he's 12 and 13 on, and it was one of the sole possessions he carried with him out of slavery when he escaped in 1838.
What was the relation for him between his reading and the pursuit of justice?
Well, Douglass became a reader before he was a writer. That's the case with most of us, of course. He collected newspapers. I mean, he famously says in the narrative, he would collect shreds of newspapers just from the street, just read whatever's in them. But his first love of reading, there's no question, came from reading the Bible. He's not only quoting Jeremiah and Isaiah and Amos and many others, the Hebrew prophets in particular, all the time here, but he's obviously really read it closely. He can throw off an Isaiah quote off the top of his head. There's no Douglass speech without uses of the Hebrew prophets, direct quotations from them, or at least references to them. And always you can sense the influence they had on his basic worldview and his basic sense of history. Douglass came to believe on one level or another that even when he grows to old age and is not very personally religious anymore, he nevertheless had come to believe early in his life that history was what was happening in society, and eventually what he would call history, was under some kind of divine hand or providence. The whole Exodus story appealed to Douglass. It appealed to African-American enslaved people in particular, because it was a journey of liberation. It was a journey from slavery to something, maybe to freedom, to a new land somehow. So his reading, his love of language first comes there, but then he starts collecting books, lots of books. He collected, for example, lots of literature, especially British. He loved Dickens. He was a total fanatic about Robert Burns. Douglass loved that romantic poetry, and he made a pilgrimage to Ayr in Scotland when he was in Scotland. It's one of the first places he wanted to see. And Burns's daughter was still alive there. And then, of course, lastly, the other tremendous influence on his literary life was Shakespeare. He owned 3 complete sets of Shakespeare. He especially liked the histories and the tragedies. Maybe he quotes once in a while from the comedies, but not nearly as much. So these influences are common 19th century influences. But he's somebody, again, who had no formal education. And then also, of course, he collected anti-slavery pamphlets, a lot of them, which were the common coin of the anti-slavery movement. I mean, they produced thousands of these tracts and the like. You know, he turns 30 years old in 1849. From about 1847 to 1851, 52, he's in his early 30s. He transforms into one of the most effective political abolitionists and advocates of the anti-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. It continues to change. He changes his views on the uses of violence.
Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe.
In the early 1850s, especially in relation to the Fugitive Slave Act, he comes out as an advocate of sometimes the uses of violence, particularly in self-defense, but not only in self-defense, against slavery. And then we look at the Douglass who evolves through the Civil War. Douglass was always the radical trying to be a pragmatist. And then sometimes the pragmatist trying to stay radical. And of course, the Civil War changes everything. It brings about the victory of his cause. Well, now what does he do? He becomes a radical patriot. I mean, you could not find a more vigorous, bitter critic of the United States of America than Douglass in parts of the 1850s. And the 4th of July speech can very much be read as this radical critique of the deepest American hypocrisy over slavery.
I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call and question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. What to the slave is the 4th of July? Speech in 1852.
And yet you find Frederick Douglass in the wake of the Civil War delivering speeches that are essentially pure patriotism of a kind that says, okay, we have been through a crucible. We've been through terrible bloodshed. We've been through terrible suffering. Our temple has been destroyed, but now we're remaking it. And it's being remade in the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments and the first Civil Rights Acts. And he actually comes to believe. He's saying by 1868 and 69, the United States should export this, should export the 14th Amendment. They should take this to the world now. That's not even thinkable for Douglass before emancipation.
You were born right there and never did leave.
Born right there and stayed there until I was about 9, 10 years old, maybe more. Mom and them didn't know where to go. You see, after freedom broke, they didn't know where to go. Turn us out just like, you turn out cattle. I say, didn't know where to go. And old master didn't tell it was free.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he didn't tell. They wait till, I think now they said they wait till 6 months out of that. 6 months. And turn them loose on the 19th of June. That's why, they celebrate that day. Colored folks celebrate that day.
That was Laura Smalley of Hempstead, Texas, recorded in 1941, sharing her memory of the original Juneteenth, the holiday commemorating the day when enslaved African Americans were finally informed of their emancipation. When we return, we'll explore how the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass developed during one of America's most turbulent times. This is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. I'm Jeffrey Rosen. Earlier this year, I spoke with documentary filmmaker Ken Burns about what he's learned from decades studying the founders and other influential figures in American history. He says that when searching for justice, you have to embrace the unfamiliar.
You begin to see the way in which, in man's fall, in our loss of grace, we have condemned ourselves to a kind of hamster wheel of existence. But, you step laterally and you're out of the wheel. And all we're looking for is the energy and the willingness, the help from others, the guidance from the wise to go, oh yeah, step sideways, and I'm out of the wheel.
And the greatest practitioners of justice in American history, Frederick Douglass and King, both practice agape. King preaches it and practices nonviolence. Douglass preaches and practices self-reliance. Do nothing with us, he says.
Yes.
You're doing with us as done the devil with us. Let us alone so that we can improve ourselves and pursue happiness with the same freedom and self-reliance as you demand for yourselves.
Douglass acknowledges all the struggles he's had with Lincoln, and that for Black people, for him, made him impatient and disappointed. But as he says, taken all in all, and measuring the man with the time, no person has better served than Abraham Lincoln. And it is such a generous comment, because he is saying, it's not Father Abraham, he's Abraham Lincoln, somebody who thought that recolonizing Blacks to Africa or South America was a good thing in April of '61 as the guns are opening up on Fort Sumter, who changes, who migrates, who comes a great distance, and who gives up his life in the service of things. I mean, you know, he presents in the summer of '62 the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet, and they said, no, you have no victories. It'll seem like the last shriek on the retreat. So he waits till he has a stalemate at Antietam, and then he issues it. It goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. It doesn't free a single slave in territory he controls. In fact, it maintains slavery because he needs Kentucky, he needs Maryland, he needs Delaware. He needs the Piedmont that he owns in Virginia. He needs New Orleans. But it's galvanic. Keeps the British and French, who are about to side with the South, from morally being able to get in. And so you're seeing a man growing. And look, at Gettysburg, he offers us the Declaration 2.0. We really do believe that all men are created equal. You know, and that this is a new birth of freedom. It's very, very powerful stuff, and it implies that there is not expected from our heroes perfection, nor do we have the right to presume that our villains are all bad, and that the humanization of the other begins the step towards the justice that we, I think, would all seek. We certainly want for ourselves to be judged for all things put together.
Douglass's opinion of Lincoln evolved over many years. For more on how that happened, here's David Blight, author of Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom.
Their connection is almost non-existent until the Lincoln-Douglas debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858. Douglass actually went out to Illinois, journalist. He's going to cover these famous debates. It's not perfectly clear which ones he was at, but he was at a couple of them. And anyone who's ever read about the Lincoln-Douglas debates will know that Stephen Douglas, in his attacks on Lincoln, even used this idea, claiming that Lincoln had been riding around in a carriage with Fred Douglass. And whenever anybody called him Fred, he hated it. Nobody called him Fred to his face. Then their so-called relationship was terrible. In 1860, Douglass wasn't sure what to do about this guy Lincoln. He was, at least, as Douglass said, an anti-slavery reputation. Good to have an anti-slavery reputation elected if possible, but Douglass just wasn't ready to fully own up to the Republican Party yet as the radical abolitionist that he was. And then in the first year and a half of the war, Douglass was a ferocious critic of Lincoln, particularly the policy of returning fugitive slaves to Confederate ownership. He was horribly impatient with the Lincoln administration's slow, if any, movement toward making war on slavery. At one point, he called Lincoln in late 1861 the most powerful slave catcher in the world. Very ugly stuff. They will first meet then, finally, in August of 1863, not at Lincoln's invitation, but because Douglass himself went to Washington and demanded a meeting. He had no appointment, and he went principally to protest the unequal treatment of black soldiers. They didn't get equal pay. They weren't allowed commissions as officers. They often had inferior weapons and so on. And Douglass had two sons in the Union Army in the 54th Massachusetts, one of whom by that point was badly wounded and recuperating in a hospital in New York City. And the other one had never got into combat because he just got sick all the time. So he's got two sons in the Army. And he meets with Lincoln. He came, and Lincoln didn't give much. Basically what Lincoln says, we're doing the best we can here. You know, sometimes you can go this far, but not that far. But look how far we've gone. Douglass, though, came away from that telling the story of how impressed he was with Lincoln. He said he'd never been treated by a white man with power with such respect, in a way that you got the sense that Douglass was awed. He was awed by Lincoln. Even though they had a respectful disagreement, you know, about what he'd gone there for. That's their first meeting. Second meeting is a year later. It's August of 1864. The war is in a very different moment. It's after the horrible bloodletting of that summer. And the outcome of the war is still very much in abeyance. And Lincoln is seriously concerned he will not be reelected in the election that fall. There's every reason to think he might not be. There's terrible war weariness. The Democrats are running George McClellan, the former general of the Army of the Potomac. And Lincoln invites Douglass to the White House to meet with him. And they had a bit of a longer meeting, and he asked Douglass's thoughts on whether the president should, you know, maybe back away from some of this emancipation policy, because it's the reason he may not be elected. It's classic wedge politics. The Democrats are painting Lincoln as the most radical, wild-eyed abolitionist the world had ever seen. They even claim he's black. They call him Abraham Africanus I. But Douglass told him there, according to Douglass, no, don't you dare. Don't back away from this at all. And Douglass thought he and Lincoln were on the same page. And it does turn out they mostly were, except Lincoln looked him in the eye and asked him to become the leader of a scheme to funnel as many slaves out of the Upper South as possible before Election Day. Now imagine this. A year ago, you can barely get the president's attention to even talk about equal treatment of black soldiers. Now he's being asked to funnel as many slaves out of the South as possible because Lincoln says to him, if I lose the election, we want emancipation to be advanced as far as possible. And Douglass left, and he went back to Rochester and started firing out telegrams and letters to various abolitionists who were going to join this effort somehow under the leadership of the War Department, but it was never clear how they were supposed to do it. There really wasn't a plan. And then came the fall of Atlanta 2 weeks later, and Sheridan's march down the Shenandoah, and Farragut's capture of Mobile Bay. All that happened in the same 10-day period, 2-week period. The whole war pivoted much more in the favor of the Union side. Northern morale began to rise again to some degree. And this scheme of funneling slaves in some kind of John Brown-style movement never happened. And Douglass was actually grateful it never happened because he didn't, frankly, have a clue how he was going to do this. And Lincoln, of course, does win re-election.
The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865.
But they'll meet one last time at the second inaugural. Douglass was in the audience, standing down to Lincoln's left. He went to Washington very purposely to be there. He had no idea what the speech was going to be. Again, he hadn't been sent a copy. But after it was over, that short, brilliant speech, Douglass followed the presidential carriage back to the White House. He had no invitation. He simply went up to the guards and said, "I'm Frederick Douglass. I want to come in." And they said, "You can't do that." And according to Douglass, he says, "Send the president a message. Frederick Douglass is out here. I want to come in." And they went in, came back out. They let him in. And in the East Room, he had this encounter with Lincoln that Douglass narrates for us. We do have at least one witness to this meeting. According to Douglass, which he writes up in the third autobiography, Lincoln came right up to him and said, "Mr. Douglass, it's no one's opinion of my speech that I want to know more than yours. What did you think of the speech?" Douglass tried to demur and say, no, Mr. President, attend to all your guests. Doesn't matter what I thought. No, I want to know what you thought. Douglass tells us, he said, "Mr. President, that was a sacred effort." Sacred. Douglass had heard the speech at that point. He could not have read it yet. Now, very quickly, it was reprinted. But when one reads the second inaugural, you realize how steeped that document is in King James language and a kind of Old Testament conception of the Almighty having his own purposes. I think, and I've said this many times, Douglass wishes he could have written that speech for Lincoln, but the fact that Lincoln wrote it and it said what it said, that slavery had caused the war and its destruction would be its result, the fact that Lincoln had said that was far more important. Because Douglass had been saying that for, 4 years, but now Lincoln was saying it. They would have met a fourth time because Lincoln sent Douglass an invitation to come to tea at the Soldiers' Home, which was the retreat, some 25-minute carriage ride from the White House. But Douglass was on the road with speaking engagements when he got the invitation that would have been late March of 65, and he had to decline. And then, of course, the assassination comes just a week or two after that. And Douglass did say he greatly regretted he hadn't. If they'd had that tea for an afternoon together, there would have been much more of a relationship probably. And if Lincoln lived, who knows how close they could have become, because Douglass could have been extraordinarily useful to Lincoln and vice versa.
One thing will be at once conceded by all generous minds. No people or class of people in this country have a better reason for lamenting the death of Abraham Lincoln and for desiring to honor and perpetuate his memory than have the colored people. And yet, we are the only people who have been in any case forbidden to exhibit our sorrow or to show our respect for the deceased president publicly. The attempt to exclude colored people from his funeral procession in New York was one of the most disgraceful and sickening manifestations of moral emptiness ever exhibited by any nation or people professing to be civilized. But what was A. Lincoln to the colored people, or they to him? As compared with the long line of his predecessors, many of whom were merely the facile and servile instruments of the slave power, Abraham Lincoln, while unsurpassed in his devotion to the welfare of the white race, was also in a sense hitherto without example emphatically the black man's president, the first to show any respect for their rights as men.
On June 1st, 1865, a largely African-American audience filled Cooper Union in New York City to hear Frederick Douglass deliver a eulogy for the slain president, Abraham Lincoln.
To our fellow white countrymen, therefore, we say, Follow your martyred president to his grave. Lay the foundation of his monument broad and strong. Let its capstone rise towards the sky. Do homage to his character, forever perpetuate his memory, but as you respect genuine sorrow, unfeigned grief, and sincere bereavement, let the colored people of this country, for whom he did so much, have space at least for one stone in that monument, one which shall tell to after-coming generations the story of their love and gratitude to Abraham Lincoln.
For Frederick Douglass, emancipation wasn't only about escaping slavery. It was about liberating the human mind to achieve the self-reliance and self-mastery that's the foundation of freedom. Justice isn't only something that we receive from others. It's something we practice every day in how we see, speak, and forgive. Justice requires loving our neighbor as ourselves. John Adams summed up the spiritual wisdom of the East and the West in a single sentence. The fundamental principle of all philosophy and all Christianity is, rejoice always in all things. I tried to sum up this ancient wisdom in a song based on another simple sentence. Whatever the question, love's the answer. I wrote it for myself and my family so all of us could remember it. Often the simplest thoughts are the hardest to practice, and that's why I wanted to share the song with you. Here's baritone James Martin with Jennifer Blythe at the piano, singing Love's the Answer.
There's lots of questions about love. I know, I know, I know, I know. Does it come from inside or from above? I know, I know, I know, I know. But whatever the question, I know, I know, I know love's the answer. If you want to know the truth of the matter, I know, I know, I know, I know. Whatever the question, love's the answer. Love's the answer. 'Cause love conquers hate and helps us calmly meet our fate, and love heals our pain. It cools and calms like the morning rain. Love isn't a state of perfect caring. I know, I know, I know, I know. It can be a struggle to keep your bearing. I know, I know, I know. But even when you struggle to accept the ones you love, just the way they are and not an image from above, you always know the answer to all questions that I know of. Love's the answer. If you want to know the truth of the matter, I know, I know, I know, I know. Whatever the question, love's the answer. Love's the answer.
Thanks for listening, friends. I'm thrilled that my new book is out now. It's called The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. Please order online or check it out at a bookstore near you. Pursuit, The Founder's Guide to Happiness, is produced by PRX Productions for the National Constitution Center. From PRX, the team is Genevieve Sponsler, Courtney Florentine, David Newtown, Sandra Lopez Monsalve, Tommy Bazarian, and Pedro Rafael Rosado. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. Frederick Douglass is portrayed by Emmanuel Desarmes. Abraham Lincoln is portrayed by Andrew Winson. The recordings you've heard of Fountain Hughes, Bob Ledbetter, and Laura Smalley are part of a collection in the Library of Congress's American Folklife Center. The collection is titled Voices Remembering Slavery: Freed People Tell Their Stories. You can hear and read more at loc.gov. From the NCC, our team is Annie Stone, Griffin Ritchie, and Bill Pollack. Music and lyrics by Jeffrey Rosen, with arrangements by Greg Stroman. The songs and incidental music feature baritone James Martin, with Jennifer Blythe at the piano and Greg Stroman on trombone for the theme song. I'm Jeffrey Rosen. In the past 11 episodes, you've heard from the historians who know the founders' stories best. In our final episode, we'll hear from podcast listeners about the big and small changes you've made to pursue happiness. This podcast was made possible with the support of the John Templeton Foundation.